to find that it was Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy who spoke. She might have confessed herself slightly rattled, and indeed was barely aware of her companions for a minute or so, nor of the further conversation of Mr. Darcy and Sir William, before Sir William clapped Mr. Darcy on the shoulder with an expansive conviviality, and they both moved off and out of the foyer. Elizabeth watched them go, then, feeling a little spark of outrage, quickly extinguished by a small wave of depression. Surely her question had not been so very jejune as all that? She had not thought so, when she put it, or at the least, she had been willing to put it to the touch. Elizabeth debated, though, still a mite disturbed. "Not a bit of it," Emma said stoutly, and little Fanny chimed in, with an, "I always think you're awfully clever, Lizzy. I couldn't do half the brain work you do, the way you do it. You really should have been a doctor." That was a thought definitely better not lingered on, so Elizabeth did not, but rather dragged her pals off for a cappuccino in the nearest student coffee bar, where no chap so elevated, and who thought so highly of himself as Fitzwilliam Darcy would ever set a distinguished and expensively shod foot. Chapter 2. And that should have been that, with a sensible girl like Elizabeth putting the matter out of her mind, and getting on with her interesting studies and lively social life. But that evening her mother called, and silly Marianne Dashwood picked up the call on the payphone in the hallway, on the floor of the nurses' hall of residence she shared with Elizabeth, as well as 30 or so other girls. She might have had enough sense to claim not to know where Elizabeth was, at least until some other passing girl got the idea and indicated whether Elizabeth herself were willing or not to take the call. But Marianne generally had precious little in the way of sense, nor intellect either, and heaven knew how she would fare in the end-of-year exams. Thus, instead of exercising the smallest tact and discretion, she cried out immediately, "Oh, Mrs. Bennet, hello. Oh, wait, I think I have seen Lizzy. I'm sure she was in the floor common room a minute ago. Hang on a minute, I'll just check, Lizzy. Lizzy." Elizabeth therefore could not, as it proved, evade a cozy chat with her mother, bringing to mind all the pleasures of home she had left behind, and all of the vaunting ambitions she'd been obliged to give up. "Lizzy." Mrs. Bennet squawked in her ear. Immediately she took ownership of the telephone receiver from a smiling and giggling Marianne. "How are you doing, my love?" She did not, however, draw breath and await an answer from her second daughter, not that Elizabeth had truly expected her to do so. "Heavens, things have been so very busy down here I am sure you cannot begin to imagine, but see, I've managed to find a moment to catch my breath and catch up with you, dear girl. How are things at St. Pemberley's, Lizzy? I expect you are having a fine old time making friends and settling into your course. Now don't tell me different, for I won't believe a word of it. Why, I remember all the fun I had back when I was a lively young probationer at Northanger Abbey, what I'd give to go back and have those old good times over again." It was not a new observation for Elizabeth, that her mother barely required the formality of any answer to her ceaseless questions, nor indeed any interpolation whatsoever from the object of her conversational fusillades, or at least very little. "I expect so," she said dutifully, wondering if she would have enough time, now, to meet Fanny in the library and go over their nephrology notes, before heading out to a student dance at the local art college with Emma and catching the last hour or so. The best time of your life, wasn't it? Certainly it had been. Elizabeth spoke as one who ought to know, given that she had heard her mother repeat the assertion innumerable times over the course of her childhood and adolescence. "And so shall it be for you, Lizzy, my dear, I quite make sure of it," Mrs. Bennet said comfortably. "You see, now, it was much more sensible altogether for you to go for a nurse, and let go of all those silly airy-fairy fancies about doing medicine. Medicine. For a girl. Now, nursing is altogether a much nicer, more feminine profession, my love." Well, no doubt it was very comfortable for Mrs. Bennet to believe it so, or at the very least to assure herself that she did. "I can assure you that there are some aspects of the job that are neither what I would describe as feminine, nor pleasant, mother," Elizabeth said now, mutinously. She could not prevent herself, in truth, for all she attempted to keep her lip buttoned around her mother, as a rule. A passing friend, Marianne's sister, Eleanor, older than the rest of them and a junior sister, noticed the expression on Elizabeth's face as she stood at the payphone in the bleak hallway, with its nasty red gloss paint and brown linoleum. Eleanor, no doubt here in the halls of residence to visit Marianne, smiled slightly, looking extremely understanding, and felt around in her dress uniform's capacious pockets, bringing out a nice new pack of filter tips. Drawing one out of the packet, she slipped it between her lips, sparked up her lighter and drew on it, transferring it to Elizabeth's mouth when it caught light. Elizabeth nodded at Eleanor in fervent thanks as the older girl continued on her way, and dragged on her smoke eagerly. She felt the powerful and comforting warmth as the tarry fumes went down, doing her constricted lungs a power of good. "Oh, I am sure you have no need to tell me that, young lady," her mother snapped back now, her good mood evaporated, and thoroughly nettled. "Don't forget that I did my training at North Angarabi District Hospital before you were born or thought of. And not one word of complaint or whining out of me did anyone ever hear." Oh, how very much Elizabeth doubted this assertion, but since she had not been on the spot to gather evidence and prove her case, it would be fruitless to challenge her mother on the issue. "It's about service, Lizzy," her mother sniffed, piously, and if Lizzy was going to get the full lecture, now, then she could only bless Eleanor all over again for her generosity with her precious smokes on a junior sister's salary. "It's a privilege," her mother continued, "and she might as well have been in the pulpit, exhorting the masses to a purer and more decent, God-fearing life. To care for those in need, to put their needs first with never a thought for oneself." Good God! Elizabeth puffed harder, about to burn her fingers as she incinerated her ciggy down to the fag end. "I sometimes think you forget what an honor it is, to serve as assistants and handmaidens to the doctors. A much finer, higher thing than to go gadding about, nose in air, trying to be a doctor yourself, young lady. And, what's more, much more likely to get you a nice medical student or even a physician as a husband, too. They don't want competition in the home, dear. What a medic wants is a nice, domesticated wife and helpmeet, and what better background for that than a good thorough nursing training?" Here it was, and it would have been madness for Elizabeth to suppose that any phone call from her mother would ever be sans this vital element. So she listened, a little while longer, but as soon as she possibly could, she made her excuses. Shivering, she got off the phone and shook herself, like one waking up from a horrid, repetitive dream. There were better things to do, after all, than to find a husband, no matter what her mother's old-fashioned opinions upon the subject. Life was real, earnest, a serious matter with serious work to be done. And damn it, she wasn't one of the husband hunters, those blonde and horsey hee-hawing young women of moneyed backgrounds and minimum intellectual capacity. No, those were the ridiculous girls they made fun of, herself and her tight little set. So she had a quiet little Paddy, in the privacy of her own thoughts, stamping her feet and throwing her toys out the pram, metaphorically speaking. Only for a moment before she collected herself, and reminded herself that she was a dignified and career-minded young woman. And one who had plans for the evening, better things to do, for sure. Chapter 3. The primary event she had planned, barring her studious and laudable library visit with Fanny, was to slip out to the intensive care unit associated with St. Pemberley's, located about half a mile down the road. A nice walkable distance, which was a fortunate thing since St. P's was located, satellite wards and all, on the grand old estate from which it inherited its name. The alleged eponymous saint of the old place's given name being nothing but a figment of the hospital founder's conventionally restricted imaginations. Out here on the old pile's large and impressive estates, out in the wilds, buses were in damnably short supply, except for the little shuttle trolley bus that carried nursing staff back and forth at officially ordained moments. Jane, of course, was currently posted on the intensive care unit as part of her duties. That was the attraction. Elizabeth felt rather strongly that she didn't get to see half enough of darling Jane, especially considering they were working in the same institution, now. Other members of the Bennet clan she could hardly get away from at times, or that was what it felt like, so persistent were the intrusions of their letters, telegrams and calls. Mrs. Bennet and Lydia were the culprits who came most readily to mind, and in relation to telegrams, Lydia in particular. The pig-tailed miscreant never seemed to be out of one type of hot water or another, these days as often featuring some unsuitable young man as not. Whenever given the chance to catch her sister for 20 minutes here and there, then, or seeing an opportunity, and seizing it, Elizabeth did not hesitate to jump at it. And once she'd reached the unit, she made sure to approach it with some caution from the staff back entrance, slipping with a shifty look from side to side into one of the forward kitchens, Croft Ward, that being the one Jane was working on this evening. Of course, Elizabeth was well aware that